Today I am back in Athens, Georgia, and I'm here for another sad, tragic story today. You see, back in 2002, a brutal murder was discovered here at this close-knit apartment complex right here behind me. It was a murder that shook this entire community to its core. Everyone loved this woman, and they couldn't believe that she had been murdered right here amongst all of these people. Right after the discovery of this brutal murder, law enforcement had very few leads, and this murder case very quickly went cold. It wound up taking 15 years before one of those few leads that they had had since the very beginning actually led them to a culprit. It's a crazy story that took detectives in multiple directions, but law enforcement never gave up. Today, like I said, I'm back here in Athens to tell this story. I'm going to show you the crime scene photos from the brutal murder that took place right here in this building behind me, and we're going to talk about the murder of Pamela Crisler. It's very sad. Today's story takes us all the way back to 2002, right here at this apartment complex. Neighbors here in this building, they started noticing a foul smell that lingered in the area for a whole day, it seemed like. So they called and they reported it, and after a little while, officers arrived here on scene, and they immediately knew what the smell was, and they tracked it down to this apartment right here, apartment 408. The officers, they didn't even go in. They immediately just called detectives, and they blocked off the scene and waited. Once detectives arrived on scene, they made entry into the apartment for the first time, where they found a woman laying on the bedroom floor, deceased. The woman was only wearing a t-shirt and panties, and she was laying face down on the floor with a sheet thrown over the top of her head. This woman had been stabbed more than 20 times in her neck and in her chest area in a brutal attack that appeared as if it were an ambush attack. Now, the apartment really wasn't destroyed. Stuff wasn't dumped out everywhere. I mean, the apartment looked fine. It's just that there was blood all over the place. It was clear to the detectives that the killer had actually come through the sliding back door on the back of the apartment here. That's how they made entry into the apartment, but that was really it. Detectives went through the apartment with a fine-tooth comb looking for any evidence that may have been left behind from the killer. They searched for some kind of murder weapon, but they never found anything. They did find, however, on the kitchen counter, there was a newspaper sitting on the edge of the kitchen counter, and on that newspaper, there was a single drop of blood, and it looked as if it had fallen straight down. Now, this single drop of blood, it was out of place. Compared to where all the rest of the blood in the apartment was, which kind of stayed towards the bedroom area, this one drop of blood being on the kitchen and nowhere else around the kitchen area made it out of place. So initially, investigators believed that it belonged to the killer. Immediately, those detectives sent that blood droplet off to be tested, and they compared it up against their DNA database, but they got no match. They were able to confirm, however, that it did not belong to the victim and that it did belong to a male, meaning it was more than likely her killer's blood. And like I said, it looked like it had just fallen straight down, so they believed that the killer had been standing over that newspaper at some point when he dropped the single blood drop there on the paper. Law enforcement was able to determine from the autopsy that the victim, this woman that they found in the apartment, was not sexually assaulted, despite her only having panties on. Apparently, she was only wearing panties to sleep in that night, and then the killer broke in and the attack happened, and it woke her up, so she had no other clothes on. So the detectives go back to the apartment, and they continue looking for something or anything that could give them a clue as to who this woman was. They still had no clue what her name was, and they were looking for some kind of motive here. Eventually, the detectives spoke with the neighboring apartment residents, and they spoke with the apartment managers, who told law enforcement that the apartment was being rented to a man named Richard Elam. Now that just created more questions for law enforcement. Who was he, and where was he, and did he do this? And yet they still had the question lingering, who was this woman that was laying dead in his apartment? Detectives managed to track down this Richard Elam. They got him on the phone, and he was actually down in Florida working. He was a contractor, and he was down in Florida working on a big job. Richard was immediately able to tell law enforcement that he was letting this woman stay in his apartment, and her name was Pamela Crisler. He told them that he had just recently met Pamela, and he thought she was nice, and he was just letting her stay there while he was down in Florida working. He told them that he normally talked to her on a daily basis. They spoke on the phone regularly, but that he hadn't been able to get in contact with her for the past 4 days. Finally, law enforcement had identified the woman they found deceased in this apartment as 49-year-old Pamela Crisler. Pamela worked as a mental health and drug abuse counselor here in Athens, Georgia, and she was loved by just about anyone who knew her. Right away, detectives started suspecting Richard Elam may have had something to do with this, because he started doing some strange things. So they get him on the phone and they tell him that Pamela has been murdered in this apartment. So Richard immediately left from Florida and started driving back to Athens. Well, while he was on the way here, he called the apartment complex managers and he asked them to cut a piece of the carpet out that had blood stains on it. And he said that he was gonna take that piece of carpet and have it tested himself, which was very weird. And the apartment complex immediately called the detectives and told them what he said. So as soon as Richard arrived back here in Athens, they sat down with him for a conversation. And during this conversation, he didn't really do anything to dispel the officer's suspicion of him. If anything, he made it worse at the beginning, because he would go on to say a few things that caught the detective's attention. Like, at one point, he just came right out and said that Pam would always go to sleep with that sliding back patio door open to let air in.
So she told me, she said, what I'm doing is I'm sleeping with a sliding glass door at nighttime, that's keeping me company. So I said, no, I'd run the air conditioner, I don't want you to be, uncomfortable.
When you said open, you mean she just opened it up?
That's right, keep them sleeping. I would say every night, that door.
Now, law enforcement already knew that that sliding back door was the killer's point of entry into the apartment, but they did not tell Richard this. So they thought it was very suspicious that he made sure to mention that during his interview, that she slept with this back door open. In the end, though, Richard Elam was able to put law enforcement in touch with people down in Florida that 100% confirmed that Richard had been down there for some time and was always in their sight, giving him an ironclad alibi. He could not have been involved with her murder. So that excluded him as a suspect. Now, for investigators, this meant they pretty much had to go back to square one. They still had the blood droplet that they were consistently checking against their database, but they never got a hit. But really, that was it. They had nothing else. The detectives did spend some time investigating Pamela's job as a mental health counselor and a drug abuse counselor. They thought maybe that it had something to do with it, and maybe one of her patients may have attacked her, either due to mental health issues or a drug abuse person who was looking to rob her and buy drugs or something like that. But those investigations never really led them anywhere either. And eventually, again, they were back to square one. So after Richard Elam was cleared as a suspect, he went back to the apartment because law enforcement had asked him to go make an inventory list of everything that was inside of the apartment, and they wanted to know if anything was missing. And Richard was able to confirm with law enforcement that only one item in the whole apartment was missing. It was a rolling shop vac that he had inside of his closet. Law enforcement tracked down this shop vac and confirmed that just days after the murder, The shop vac was sold to a pawn shop here in Athens by a black male who appeared to be in his 20s, but because he was selling it to him, the pawn shop never got an ID or a name from him, and they didn't have any security cameras up. So even though they had recovered this shop vac, it led them nowhere. A short time later, Richard was here at the apartment complex, and some of his neighbors were out in the parking lot here talking. And Richard just went up to them and asked if they saw anyone taking a shop vac out of his apartment prior to Pam's murder. Now, him saying this triggered one of the neighbors who lived down the hall. That neighbor recalled that on the night of Pam's murder, she was still awake and she heard some noises coming from out in the hallway area. So she got up and she looked through the peephole in her door, and she saw an African-American male coming out of Richard's apartment where Pam was, rolling a shop vac. She stood there at the door looking through the peephole, watching him for a moment, and she said that she had a can of Coke in her hand, so she popped the tab on it to open it, and at that point, apparently the person who was rolling that shop vac heard it, because they stopped and they stood up and they looked at her door as she was looking through the peephole at them. And this neighbor said that the man stood there and looked at her door for just a moment, and then he bent back down and started rolling that shop vac, and he went down the hall and he left, and she never saw him again. For whatever reason, she had forgotten this information when law enforcement came and talked to her. At that point, it had been several days past. At the time, in the middle of the night, it didn't seem suspicious to her. So after it happened, she went to bed and forgot about it until Richard brought it up that day out in the parking lot, and it reminded her. So this neighbor immediately called the investigators and told them everything that happened, how she had forgotten about it and how Richard had asked her, and it caused her to remember. And she had seen Pamela's killer and she didn't even know it. So she was able to go sit down with a police sketch artist, and they were able to make a sketch of who their suspect was. They plastered this sketch in newspapers and magazines and everywhere they could, hoping that someone would come forward and tell them who this person was, but no one ever did. No one ever came forward to tell them who it was. No new leads came in after this, and Pamela's case went cold. For over a decade, nothing else happened on Pamela's case. It just sat there cold. Other cases were coming in and the detectives were having to work those. Nothing happened on Pamela's case. And then all of a sudden, 15 years later, in 2017, Pamela's case would get thrust right back into the spotlight, and very, very quickly it would escalate. It all started when one day, out of the blue, the detective who was responsible for Pamela's murder case, he got a Codis match on his computer system from the blood droplet that was left on that newspaper on the counter. That DNA belonged to a man named Abdus Salam LaRoche. Abdus LaRoche was actually known to law enforcement outside of Athens, Georgia, because of a situation that happened in Eatonton, Georgia, when Abdus was just a young kid. So there was this man named Dwight York, and he started this group of people that was called the Nawubian Nation. It was a cult. So they moved down here to Georgia from New York. He came down and he bought this large plot of land out in a rural area in Eatonton, Georgia, and he built this massive black and gold Egyptian temple pyramid. And it was crazy because you could just be driving down the road and you would have nothing but trees on both sides of you, and then all of a sudden you came upon this massive shiny gold Egyptian pyramid. It was crazy. And Abdus was part of this cult, the Nawubian Nation. Abdus LaRoche was one of a group of young children who actually came forward and accused this Dwight York, or Dr. York as the cult called him. They accused this Dr. York of molesting them. Now, Dwight did have a federal trial in Atlanta, and Abdus testified against him in that trial. But later on, in 2008, Abdus came forward and provided a statement claiming that he had lied in that federal trial that sent Dwight York to prison. It didn't make any difference, though, Abdus coming forward and saying that he lied. None of the other people came forward and recanted, so Dwight York is still sitting in prison to this day. So Abdus had gotten arrested for selling bootleg pirated CDs in Athens, which is a misdemeanor. So he went to court for it, and he was sentenced to probation. And while he was on probation, he got stopped by police again, and he was caught with methamphetamine this time, which was a violation of his probation, and it was a felony. And anytime you're arrested for a felony, they take your DNA and they put it into their Codis system. As Abdus Salam LaRoche was put into jail, they swabbed his mouth. The DNA was sent off to be put into the system, and the detective got a match. Law enforcement immediately began trying to trace LaRoche's whereabouts back in 2002. And unbelievably, they learned that he lived in the same apartment complex here as Pamela did. It was just in a different building. So Pamela lived over here in this building back in the corner, and Abdus LaRoche lived all the way in this apartment over here across the way, and that's why they never talked to him. So there's an old saying in law enforcement, you know, they don't really believe in coincidences, and it wasn't a coincidence that this man lived in the same apartment complex as where the murder took place. So they went even further, and they pulled his old high school yearbooks to get a picture of what he looked like in 2002, and then they matched it up to the sketch that had been made with the neighbor from down the hall, and as you can see, they are almost identical. Immediately, law enforcement went from one day they had this cold case and they had no leads and they had no answers and they had no hope, to the very next day they had a DNA match, and now they had a suspect. So they bring Abdus LaRoche in for an interview. During this interview with Abdus LaRoche, of course, initially he denied having anything to do with Pam's murder.
I'm David Norris. This is Jerry Salters. We just wanted to talk to you a little bit. We're with Athens, Clark County, and we work cold cases. And we're going back over some cases. And while we were going back over some, we were reviewing some of the reports and stuff. And we saw that there was your last name, LaRoche, maybe lived over in an area where an incident happened at years ago. And we didn't see where anybody had talked to anybody, either you or your family or anything like that. And so we just wondered if you'd ask us, help answer a few questions and kind of go over some stuff like that.
With my sister, but
Detective Norris actually informed Abdus that they had his DNA all over the apartment here. And over the course of the 2-hour interview, Abdus changed his story multiple times.
Well, this has been an unsolved case until they took your DNA, and we knew from the physical evidence that whoever, because we're just trying to be honest with you,
So y'all
okay?
picking
We knew for a fact that we've had this profile on record for the last 15 years, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And we knew that if we ever got a DNA hit through Codis, which is the national database, that's going to lead to the person responsible for it.
Abdus tried to explain away his DNA being in the apartment at first by saying that Pamela had actually paid him a few dollars to come in and take some trash out.
you know, like if I was trying to make extra money, I made $40 like taking out trash, but that was about it though. But I didn't really know her personally. I don't even know who she is.
Okay.
I knocked on doors here and there, but that's about it.
He then started claiming that he walked into the apartment and found Pamela dead, but because he was just a young kid, he ran off scared. But to law enforcement, he put himself at the scene.
I mean, I don't know what happened before she was already like in that situation. But I know afterwards I came, I seen, I tried to move, you know, chief, you know, budging, and, you know, but I ran out, like ran out.
Abdus' story then changed into his DNA was in her apartment because he and Pamela were having an affair, which wasn't true at all. And he actually wound up calling Pamela a cougar multiple times throughout this 2-hour interview, which was all untrue. None of it was true at all.
We're talking to the right guy. We want to know what happened. We want to know what went
I had an
on.
affair with a cougar in Athens, and I don't know if it was that same person, but I did help her. I started off helping her, but It wasn't, you know, but I damn sure didn't go in there fighting and murder nobody.
Detective Norris asked Abdus at one point how his DNA got under her fingernails, and Abdus doubled down on his claims of them having an affair by saying that she was rough in bed and she scratched him all the time.
Why? I mean, because that DNA, I mean, I probably did fuck her, but I mean, or she probably did scratch me while we was fucking, because I did, you know, was somebody and I got, like, you know, she had some sharp nails.
After 2 hours, Abdus eventually got up and said if he wasn't under arrest, he needed to leave because he needed to go to work. And Detective Norris then served a new search warrant on him for another swab of DNA so they could confirm it against what they had.
I'm just ready to go. If I'm under arrest, I mean, if I'm not, I mean, I didn't do nothing. You know, I mean, I want to go to work. Cause I didn't, or if I got to get a lawyer, let me know.
That's up to you.
Yeah, you only need a lawyer if you done something wrong.
Yeah, I know, but yeah, you saying I did something wrong.
We believe you did.
Okay, so I mean,
we do have a.
Y'all got an address for me, right? Y'all got my address.
Yeah. One thing we do need to do is we got a search warrant for your DNA. Okay. So we're going to execute that.
Now, at the same time that they were talking to LaRoche, unbeknownst to him, the FBI received a call on their tip line from someone who claimed to be part of Abdus LaRoche's family. This family member calls the FBI tip line and he tells them that Abdus LaRoche had actually confessed to him years prior that he had killed Pamela Crisler.
Thank you for calling the FBI. Can I have your first name, please?
Ezra.
And how can I help you today?
I'm calling to give you guys a tip, and I guess just to confirm what you guys have already been working on. His name is Abdus Salam LaRoche, and he's like a suspect in the case against Pamela Crisler, who was murdered in 2002. Yeah, he basically told me that he did it.
Okay.
He told me how it happened and everything. And I didn't believe him when he told me this about 5 years ago.
Okay, and what exactly did he say at that time?
He told me that he had went inside of this house to invade it, to, you know, take some things and rob it. Then he ended up she ended up waking up and he ended up having to kill her. I know for a fact that he's guilty. And then you guys have substantial evidence against him. And the reason why that I'm actually calling is because I'm actually mad at him as my brother, because a year or two ago I didn't know, but he ended up setting me up to get robbed, and I got robbed before by him. So it's like I'm kind of doing this not in like to retaliation to get back at him, but just off of a sense of honesty, and that like he literally did tell me this, and I'm not on his side. He's not my brother or anything anymore. Like I haven't been having relationships with him for the last 3-4 years. I cut him off.
Okay.
So, yeah, so they have everything in there, and I'm just calling to be a good citizen and to say that I heard of this before, and that he did it. He's guilty.
So with the DNA match and this family member calling the FBI tip line, officers officially arrested Abdus LaRoche and charged him with Pam's murder. Pamela's family couldn't believe it. They had, I guess, gotten to the point where they just expected this person was going to get away with it, and now all of a sudden, out of the blue, someone was arrested and charged for her murder. Now, as time went along, Abdus was sitting in the Clark County Jail just waiting for his trial. The district attorney here in Athens began trying to build a case against him, and he started worrying that this case was going to be very difficult to prove. So this district attorney went to Abdus LaRoche, and they offered him a plea deal where if he pled guilty to involuntary manslaughter and burglary, he would get out of prison one day versus getting convicted for murder and possibly getting life in prison or a death sentence. Abdus Salam LaRoche actually took the plea deal without hesitation, and he pled guilty to involuntary manslaughter and burglary in open court and he was sentenced to 20 years in prison for Pam's murder. Abdus LaRoche is currently serving his 20-year sentence right here at Wheeler Correctional Facility, which is where he will reside until the year 2038. But then, once he's released, he will have to serve an additional 20 years on probation, meaning he will be on Department of Corrections supervision until he's a very old man. As he's probably close to 40 now, meaning he'll be about 55 when he gets out, and then it'll be, 20 years after that, so he'll be 75 by the time his probation was over. And if he does wind up violating his probation at any point during that 20 years, they're just going to send him right back to prison for the rest of his time, for the rest of those 20 years. So it's unlikely that Abdus LaRoche will be causing any more problems for society. As I said earlier, I have Abdus LaRoche's interview with law enforcement. It's just the audio, but I am going to post it on my channel tomorrow if you want to hear it. It's actually pretty crazy, but that's going to do it for this episode today from here in Athens, Georgia, and the murder of Pamela Crisler. I want to thank you all so much for watching. I really appreciate it. If you're new here, go down, hit that subscribe button, then hit that notification bell so you get notified every time I upload a video. Thank you all. I will see you again in the next one. Please, all of you, stay safe and stay healthy. Much love to you all.